How much is left in the tank for Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata? And will Jessie Bates and AJ Terrell be the playmakers that the Falcons need to solidify their secondary?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down and the sports stop sporting like we want them to. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. You may also know me as Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I appreciate each and every one of you that knows my AKAs because you tune in each and every day to this podcast and make it your first listen, whether you skip the AKAs or you just are sitting here seething that I didn't call myself the iron that sharpens the iron, because you're like, Aaron, you got to do all the AKAs every single day. Why else am I here listening to this? I appreciate all you everydayers, right? And all you got to do to become an everydayer so that you can either hear the AKAs or skip the AKAs is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will be talking about monogamy, right? That will become later in the conversation because we'll be talking about Jessie Bates, and later we'll talk about AJ Terrell. And, you know, really the bulk of today's episode is talking about sort of the proven veterans. We have a lot of question marks on this Falcons defense, a lot of young players that we're expecting to step up. And instead of talking about, okay, who's going to step up, let's talk about the guys of the old tried and true reliables, you know, that are the guys that make this defense go, and whether or not they're going to be as tried and true as they have been in recent years. And we'll start that conversation with the guys up front. And to me, it's really about kind of the floor and the ceiling, right? Where the established guys are sort of setting the floor for your defense. And then how many of those unproven guys that sort of have those breakout years are going to potentially raise the defense for raise the ceiling for this defense. And when we talk about Grady Jarrett, we talk about David Onyemata, you know, we've talked about how all offseason long, these guys are your two most proven pass rushers and how they're going to be sort of the anchors of your pass rush. That if the Falcons pass rush is good this year, it's going to be because these two guys are sort of setting the floor as being difference makers up front. And we've seen the Falcons kind of adopt this team building strategy when it's come to their pass rush, which is to sort of lean into that by making additions, especially on the defensive line interior, with the idea of like, that's going to allow you to have a deeper rotation there. And that's going to keep these guys fresher so that they can potentially theoretically put their best foot forward when they do get there out there on the field. And that was, you know, the reasoning behind the Falcons trading for Kentavious Street last year when we were talking about that, you know, 2 weeks before that trade went down, where it's like the Falcons have a clear lack of D-tackle depth and they need to sort of shore up that position, and they continue to shore up that position, bringing back Kentavious Street, drafting Ruka Roro, drafting Brandon Dorless, etc., you know, and the incomparable Eddie Goldman in the mix. But one does wonder a little bit with both Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, can they be the anchors that you need them to be at this point in their careers? Both of those guys are 31. Onyemata will turn 32 in November. Grady's coming off an ACL tear after a down season by what I think is his usual standards. And, you know, I stress that we're talking about Grady Jarrett's usual standards, right? That if we're measuring Grady Jarrett's half of 2023 against, you know, the other 150 or so interior D linemen in the NFL, like, it was a very good year. However, when we look at what Grady Jarrett's overall body of work has been throughout his, you know, 9 years in the NFL, I would argue that last year was probably his weakest since his rookie season, right? And we had a similar conversation about Matt Ryan on this podcast during his final years, where it's like, yeah, if I was judging Matt Ryan by the standards I would judge Andy Dalton or Gardner Minshew, yeah, Matt Ryan's playing outstanding these last couple of years. But if I'm judging Matt Ryan by the standard that he set for the previous decade here in Atlanta, like, he clearly, to me, is on the decline. And so to me, that's more a worry with Grady at this point than it is with Onyemata. Age and injury aren't necessarily helping things in either regard, but age and injury are arguably, Father Time's greatest allies when it comes to sort of his undefeated record. And this year, I think the pass rush is going to be matter more, right? Because I think we're going to face a higher level of quarterback than we faced on average last year. And several of those matchups, we're going to need pressure in order to deal with that higher level of quarterback and exploit some of those offensive lines. And there are several matchups where we're looking at, some quality offensive lines, but we say, hey, if anybody's going to be able to take advantage of this offensive line, I'm looking at like Philadelphia or Seattle or Tampa Bay, where they have really good tackles, or the strength of their offensive line is at the tackle position, but the weakness of their offensive line is potentially on the interior at center and guard. That's where you're going to need a guy like Grady Jarrett or David Onyemata kind of put the Superman cape on their back and sort of take over those games. And, while we're talking about potential decline for them, it's not because I'm sitting here saying like, oh, those guys are cooked or they're washed or anything at this point, but it is wondering like, is the floor going to be lower this year for your defense overall, because you're not getting sort of the typical production that you're getting from those guys as you've gotten in the past, where instead of the 4 to 5 sacks that those guys are both averaging, the 40 plus pressures that those guys have averaged throughout their NFL careers, maybe you only get 2 sacks, right, from each guy, and maybe you only get 32 pressures or something like that. And all of a sudden, those are down years. Again, good years for most D tackles in the NFL, but down years for both Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. And then can the rest of your pass rush with all these unknowns like Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter and these rookies and whatnot, can they pick up the slack? Instead of, you're already kind of hoping for 8 to 10 sacks from Arnold Ebiketie. Now does he need to get 12 sacks? You're already kind of hoping for a career high 6 sack season for Lorenzo Carter. Does he need to now get like 8 sacks or whatever the case may be? So, with the rookies, we've talked before about how, like, on average, rookies drafted, on day 2, day 3 of the draft, at those positions are getting 1 or 2 sacks on average in their rookie seasons. And now if, Grady and David Onyemata aren't up to sort of, be those anchors on your pass rush, do you now need to see those guys get 3 or 4 or 5 sacks as rookies and be those sort of rare outliers when it comes to that? So I think it's a legit question to wonder how much is left in the tank for both of these two guys. Can they carry the burden of sort of anchoring and spearheading that pass rush? And, are we going to be sitting here on crossover Thursdays talking about these key matchups and feeling confident that Grady or David Onyemata is going to be able to put on the Superman cape and sort of take over a game if the Falcons need it in order to exploit some of those matchups? So that, to me, is going to be a question this year. And while we're questioning the guys up front, we'll spend the rest of the day questioning whether or not there are concerns on the back end, starting with Jessie Bates. And will the new defensive scheme allow Jessie Bates to be the cheater that we know he loves to be? But in the NFL, guys, you want to find quality professionals that fit your team. And the same is true for your small business. And that's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just any old job board, because they're going to help you find professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those that aren't even actively searching for a job, but just might be open for the perfect role, because in any given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the question I have is, will Jessie Bates blossom in the cover 3 heavy scheme that we expect Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake to deploy this year? Right? Because we know that Jessie Bates hates monogamy. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say stuff like that, it's a running gag that dates from the second half of the 2023 season. That is, Jessie Bates loves to cheat. And before we explore that further, I want to let you guys know that you shouldn't cheat yourself when it comes to those can't miss stories and analysis on all the sports topics that you want. And make sure you don't cheat yourself by heading over to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. But, I don't know if Jessie Bates is cheating in the real world, I don't know anything about his real life relationships, but on the football field, my man will step out on you at the drop of the hat. And what that means is when you go back and you look at a lot of the game changing plays that Jessie Bates made last year, and he made plenty of them, a lot of them involved him sort of spurning what his assignment is, right? It's the idea of like, do your job and worry about your job and not about the other 10 guys. And Jessie Bates is like, no, I ain't going to do my job. I'm going to worry about what other people are doing, and I'm going to cheat on routes. I'm going to jump routes when I'm not supposed to do that. And that led to a lot of game changing plays. Like, again, I would qualify 3 out of his 6 interceptions were examples of that. The first one he had against Carolina in week 1, the pick 6 he had against the Saints in week 12, and then the pick he had against Tim Boyle the following week and against the Jets. And I think you can make an argument that at least 2, if not all 3 of those plays, that without him making those plays, especially in the Carolina and Saints game, that the Falcons theoretically could have lost both of those games without Jessie Bates making those plays, right? That, those games would have been a lot closer than they wound up being. And the Falcons, when it comes to a 1-score game in the fourth quarter, odds aren't necessarily always in the Falcons' favor, historically speaking, but you never know. So the question I have is, will Jessie Bates be able to make those same game-changing plays in this scheme? Again, we're assuming that the Falcons, under Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake, are going to deploy a lot more cover 3 than they did last year. And while Jessie Bates is the prototypical center fielding post safety, that single high role that you would like in that sort of scheme, you're probably sitting there wondering, like, he's the prototype. So why is that a concern? Why is that a question mark for you? Because typically the cover 3 compared to other coverages, especially like quarters, cover 4 for those unfamiliar, tends to, I guess you would say, push monogamy a little bit more. It's a little more conservative of a coverage. It doesn't necessarily give you as much freedom, especially when you're playing that single high role, to sort of cheat on plays. Jessie Bates is going to feel like he's being shackled. It feels like, he's going to have to unlock his phone for his girlfriend so that she can check up on him, that sort of thing, right? And, again, it doesn't necessarily mean, you can't cheat if you play cover 3. Earl Thomas was a notorious cheater on the field during his Seahawk days, and then, unfortunately for him, off the field during his Ravens days. Google it if you don't know what I'm talking about. And that led to some problems and him being ousted from the league. But, typically when you're posting that sort of deep safety, that center fielder in cover 3, like 20, 25 yards on the field, you're going to have less opportunities to sort of jump some of those intermediate routes that we saw Jessie Bates doing so effectively last year on some of those game-changing plays. All right. And, one of the things that we can expect, though, I think, is, especially given the conversation we had with Cody Alexander back in late May, Cody Alexander match quarters, talking about the Raheem Morris scheme and how one of the hallmarks and staples of that Rams scheme under Raheem Morris was you sort of present 2 high looks pre-snap, and then you rotate into a single high look in cover 3 post-snap. And that allows one of those safeties, when he's rotating down, to be that sort of buzz defender, typically the strong safety in that role. And that could theoretically allow Jessie Bates to do some of the cheating that we know he loves to do. And that would be great for him. But then the question is, okay, well, if Jessie Bates is playing that buzz defender role and playing those sort of underneath and jumping those intermediate routes, that puts the other safety in the position where he's going to have to be the center fielder. And is that the right role for DeMarco Hellams or Richie Grant, right? We talked about when we drafted DeMarco Hellams that when Alabama put him in that sort of deep responsibility role, he struggled in that, right? Because he doesn't necessarily have the ideal speed, range, and instincts to play that center fielder role. And he's actually probably better suited as a sort of classic cover 3 box safety to be more of that buzz defender, because he has to cover less space and he can play a little bit more downhill. And so whatever, athletic limitations he may have in coverage get exposed less. But are you going to ask him to do that if you're going to ask Jessie Bates to do that? And he's going to have to be more of that deep safety. Now, you watched the film last year, like it didn't show up on film. There weren't any instances of like, oh, DeMarco Hellams is way out of position and blowing this coverage. But one of the things that I noticed watching the All 22 is there are still times where you're just like, yeah, I think this issue that was an issue at Alabama in terms of the speed, range, and instincts is still an issue. It just didn't get exposed. Again, part of that may be because we're watching DeMarco Hellams play against Tim Boyle and Gardner Minshew, and that's, it's easier to avoid those guys exploiting you, but now you're going to have to do it against Jalen Hurts and the Eagles, or Patrick Mahomes with Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown. And those outside corners against that type of speed are going to definitely need a little bit more safety help in that regard. So you wonder about that. And then you talk about Richie Grant, right? Richie Grant from his days at Central Florida and here in Atlanta has more experience playing that single high role. He's done that a number of times, but we know Richie Grant is kind of up and down in that role. He's been particularly susceptible to biting on double moves and whatnot. And so are you putting Richie Grant in a position to succeed if you're asking him to play more of that deep role? And so that to me is a question for that. And so it's not to say that, hey, this scheme is going to turn Jessie Bates into a bad player. It just may not give him the freedom that he had last year to slip that waitress his number when he's writing the check, or when he's out with the boys and he's not answering his phone at 2 a.m. I don't know if he's going to be able to do those types of things in this scheme, especially with the expectation that Morris and Lake are going to want more of that bend but don't break style, and it's going to be more emphasis on not giving up the big plays. And Jessie Bates is like, I'll take that risk if I'm allowed to cheat. So that is one of the questions I wanted. So again, it's not to say, Jessie Bates is going to suck this year under the scheme, but if last year he was a 10 out of 10, and I think that's a fair rating for him as the MVP of the entire roster and the best player on the team last year, and arguably single-handedly won you 2 games last year, if he quote unquote falls to being an 8 out of 10, which is still one of the best safeties in the league and sort of typical of what we've seen from Jessie Bates over the course of his career, that's still great and valuable to your defense, but is that going to lead to less game-changing plays? And again, I don't know the answer to that. He could easily have a better season than he had, just as likely, but we know having 5 plus interception seasons in consecutive years doesn't happen very often for safeties. Like I think it's only happened like 4 times over the last decade. So I do wonder a little bit about that. But when we're talking about, the scheme hurting Jessie Bates, the other player in the secondary that is expected to kind of anchor that unit is AJ Terrell. And I think it's less of a scheme issue with AJ Terrell and wondering what he's going to perform like, and more about the personnel at that cornerback 2 spot. Is that player going to help AJ Terrell be in a position to succeed? And we'll talk about that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, it is summertime, and we know the summer is great for a lot of things, but it's not always great when it comes to sports because the playoffs are over. We get fewer games, whether you're a baseball guy or not, it's just not a whole lot going on. So sports aren't sporting like we want them to, but FanDuel is here to keep the party going because this summer they're hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. And whether you want to bet on baseball or bet on the upcoming NFL season, you want to put in your odds for Zachary Risachet for, rookie of the year odds and NBA, FanDuel has you covered. Just head on over again to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of the summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So the question I have to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons is, can AJ Terrell sort of have that bounce back year? And we talked about this back in January when we were doing our year-end positional breakdowns and talking about the cornerback room and sort of talking and me basically pushing back on the narrative that AJ Terrell was bad in 2023. Now, by my account, like it was not his best season by all accounts, but I think the perception that it was bad was mostly fueled by that he gave up, a few more explosive plays than we have grown accustomed to him doing over the years. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's bad. Instead, what happened was a lot of those big plays that he was giving up, you remember those plays, right? I've talked about this a lot on the podcast over the years, which is, when you're watching the games live on Sunday, you tend to react positively or negatively, depending on what happens, on the splash plays. So you tend to focus too much on the touchdowns and the interceptions and the fumbles and those missed tackles and all that stuff. And that can skew your perception because you tend to focus on 5 plays as opposed to the 500 plays that make up a player's overall body of work over the course of a season. And that can skew perception a little bit. And I think that was a situation with AJ Terrell where it's like you're focusing on the 5 extra negative plays that he had. And you want to see AJ Terrell kind of bounce back and get those explosive plays back under control. I think the number I quoted back in January was, by my count, my charting, he gave up 11 explosive plays of 20 yards or more last year. based off my charting of the defense, which was the same number that he had in combined in 2021 and 2022. So, we want to see that number get cut in half, and so we can get back to sort of peak AJ Terrell like we saw in those years. But, one of the things that that stood out watching him give up those big plays, a lot of those came in instances where he was in zone coverage, cover 3, cover 4, with those sort of deep responsibilities where he is responsible in cover 3 for the deep third of the field or a deep quarter of the field in that quarters coverage. And you don't have safety help in those situations. And unfortunately for AJ Terrell and the Falcons defense, too often in those situations, that receiver, whether it was a Mike Evans or whether it was a blown coverage against Calvin Ridley in that London game against the Jaguars, or DeAndre Hopkins kind of pushing off against him in that Titans game, where he got the short end of the stick on those particular plays. And you do wonder, again, with an emphasis on cover 3, is he going to be put in those situations again this year? But to me, the bigger concern with AJ Terrell is less about the scheme and more about his historic tendencies to struggle against physical receivers. We just named a couple, like DeAndre Hopkins pushing off. Mike Evans, has given him problems. Mike Thomas over the years. We saw A.T. Perry beat him on like an 18-yard touchdown in that Week 18 matchup. You go back all the way back to Jamar Chase, pushing him around and bullying him in that national championship game. And, that's a weakness of AJ Terrell, is like the receivers that have given him the most problem going back, the last 5 years typically are those more physical wide receivers. And, that could be a problem in certain games. There's not a ton of games where that could be an issue, but that could be exacerbated this year because of who's going to line up opposite him. Because when you look at, whoever's going to potentially win that CB2 job, which is whether that's Mike Hughes or Clark Phillips, are those guys the guys that you want matching up with those physical receivers as well? Like, you would argue that like those guys will even have a bigger issue against those. Like, take, for example, AJ Brown when we play the Eagles in week 2, right? AJ Brown, as physical as they come in the NFL. And that's the type of wide receiver that historically AJ Terrell would have problems with in winning at the catch point, where he can get out physicaled. And it's like, you put AJ on AJ, and that probably is more problem for the Falcons than it is for the Eagles. But is the solution to that problem putting Clark Phillips on AJ Brown or putting Mike Hughes on AJ Brown? I don't think that is. I think that potentially leads to more problems, where he has even a bigger size advantage over those guys than he has over AJ Terrell. And so does that lead to the Falcons, whether it's in the Eagles game or in other games throughout the season, is that putting AJ in a position to succeed? Because now he's going to have to take on more of that burden of dealing with these bigger physical wide receivers that typically give him problems. And that puts him in a position where he's going to get exploited a little bit more. And so that, to me, is where my questions are. It's like the question marks at the CB2 spot, to me, potentially could put AJ Terrell in a position where he's not put in a position to succeed, like we consider good coaching to be. And so that you wonder a little bit about that, right? So to me, it's less of a scheme issue with AJ Terrell and more of a personnel issue with AJ Terrell. And so overall, when you look at the collectively this group, and you wonder a little bit about Caden Ellis, who's probably your proven option in the middle of your defense, playing that Mike linebacker, and we know that Ryan Nielsen knew exactly how to deploy him. Now, again, you look at how Raheem Morris deployed Ernest Jones over the last couple of years with the Rams, and you say, okay, just same thing that you want Caden Ellis to do. So, I'm not too worried about Caden Ellis falling off a cliff in this scheme, under Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake, because they're not Ryan Nielsen, but it is certainly a small concern in that regard. And so when you look at these 4 or 5 guys on your defense, that there are these sort of anchor points that are the proven players, and then you're just kind of figuring out at the other half dozen or so spots of hoping that more of those young guys can step up. Again, you do wonder if all of those anchor points maybe take a small step back this year, does that lower the floor for your defense? And we'll see how that affects this upcoming season. Again, it's a big reason why I tend to put a lot more stock in the offense to sort of be the driving force of this team's success in the defense, because there's just so many questions. But, I think the assumption that so many people are making, as you are wont to do, I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but sort of the natural assumption that, we as fans make is like, Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake are going to be able to build off of the success that Ryan Nielsen was able to accomplish last year. And we had that sort of scrappy unit that was really good at getting stops, right? Top 5 in third down defense, top 5 in red zone defense, right? Like we were that bend but don't break defense that when it came to, key money downs on third downs in the red zone, when the Falcons need to stop, far more often than not, they got those stops. And then you compare that to the Rams, where, they were 18th on third down defense. They were 15th in red zone defense. And again, that is more than respectable for what you were expecting out of the Rams defense last year, given so many problem areas. But relative to last year's Falcons defense, that is a step back. And that is not necessarily building off of Ryan Nielsen's success if we go back to being more average in those areas than we are. And then, of course, if you take those step backs in those money downs, do you offset it in other areas? And it's like, that means maybe you do need to get more turnovers. And then you wonder, okay, if Jessie Bates has 3 interceptions instead of 6, like he had last year, do you get 3 interceptions from AJ Terrell instead of the 0 that he's had the last 2 years? So that can be one of the ways that it gets offset. And so, these are some of the unknowns that I have. And I know typically, depending on who you are, like when you are presented with an unknown, you can either look at it optimistically and say, oh, anything could happen, something good might happen, we don't know. Or you can be the other type of person where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen, but something bad could happen, right? And I'm sure you guys can guess which end of that spectrum I typically fall under. Although last year I tended to be more the optimistic side when it came to those unknowns, and that burned me with the Falcons, as it is often so do. It did not follow my cardinal rule, which is always lower your expectations with the Atlanta Falcons, and you will not get hurt. But they always find ways to hurt me. This is the burden that we all face as Falcon fans of dealing with the pain and the frustration of rooting for this football team. So hopefully one day we will be rewarded for all the hard work that we have put in, all the frustration, blood, sweat, and tears that we have put in as fans, that the players also put in as players. So we'll see if this defense can build upon this. But as I said, like, we're looking at this situation where we're hoping that our quote unquote aces, our proven guys, are going to be able to maintain their level of play, and that to me remains an open question. So I think this is a fair question to have. We won't have the answers to this until we get to September, but we'll just sort of have to see how it all comes together for this defense, and if they can kind of piece it together to be that sort of supplementary, complementary unit, to what we're hoping to be this potent offense. And the defense doesn't have to be great; they just kind of have to be good enough to win games. So that's really the story of the Raheem Morris defenses over the years, which is good enough. It's not great defense, it's good enough. And so I think they can pull that off. But I think a big part of that is going to be, several of these players that are, again, the anchors, the proven guys, maintaining or making rebound seasons, and several of those young players stepping up. So wanted to get that topic discussed on today's episode. Tomorrow's episode, we will have our last Falcons historian player shootout of round 2 before we move on to the third round. Just a couple more episodes left. We will get through those over the next couple of weeks in training camp. Tomorrow's episode, I believe, is Desmond Trufant, is the Falcons legend we'll be breaking down. Speaking of, cornerbacks that don't get interceptions, talking about AJ Terrell, Desmond Trufant. And that will be Kevin Knight and David Shealy in that matchup. So make sure you tune in for that. And then, of course, the following day we'll be talking about our first reports of training camp, and we'll be talking about what training camp is all about and what the preseason is all about, and why we don't necessarily put as much stock in practice as maybe other people do. Those will be maybe topics that we'll explore later this week. And of course, I think we're going to have Jarvis at the end of the week to give his report from day 1 of training camp. So that is something that is in store for you at the end of this week. So make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, so you can get the latest episode as soon as it is available. That's going to do it for us here, guys. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.